Progress is everything, and in today's video, we're soaring to new heights because we've harnessed the power of electricity. From futuristic power plants to powerful, towering factories. From automated farming to the power of the generator, we're making more machines, we're making more progress, we're making our way back to the old moon base because now we are at 700 days in the Minecraft mod Create. You want to play mod packs with friends, but you can't seem to find a good server. And the free ones? With the big mod packs these days, free servers are just too laggy. Luckily for you, there's BISECT hosting. They host my server, and with plenty of affordable options, they can host your server too. And the best part is, they support almost every mod pack. Use code Doublesal at checkout for 25% off your first order. BISECT hosting, a great site for great servers. If I was gonna have a successful 700 days, I was gonna have to do it on a full belly. You can't work on an empty stomach, so I went to the kitchen to see what there was, and well, there wasn't a lot. Thank you, Noah. I was gonna have to farm my own food because as you can see here, there's not a lot of farming going on. That was Noah's job and well, he just hasn't been online. So I was gonna have to do the work myself and prepare a beautiful, fully functional, automated wheat farm. Yes, this wheat farm was gonna be a marvel, a true testament of our technological standing, but to do that we had to start small. Buckets of water, a simple iron hoe, and tilling the ground the way all farmers do. After that I planted some seeds, but that was just the beginning. We were going to automate this, and to do that we needed a cart assembler. The cart assembler was going to allow me to create a contraption that would automatically go back and forth between the wheat fields, harvesting every single wheat block. I had to deal with these annoying skeletons who ambushed me in the middle of the night, and once they were taken care of, I laid down some tracks for the machine I was about to build. With the cart assembler placed, I began adding these linear chassis blocks. They were going to make up the main frame of this whole contraption. Next, I added glue in front of the frame, that way I could apply these harvesters. The harvesters were going to be dedicated to breaking up the wheat blocks and putting them in a chest. With the harvesters added, the machine was nearly complete. I added a chest for storage, and then it was simply a matter of gluing it all together. I then added a block called a portable storage interface, which allows me to extract every single wheat item from the machine. Yes, everything was coming together. All I had to do now was do one more little glue over, and then it was simply a matter of waiting for the wheat to grow. And when it did, we were greeted with a beautiful golden field that was ready for harvesting. I just needed one more block, a filter known as a brass funnel, and to make that, well, I had to make brass by mixing copper and zinc. Here's what the brass funnel does. You see, the brass funnel basically acts as a filter. If I only want wheat to come out, I can put a wheat filter on it, and only wheat will come out. Now to make brass itself, I needed a block called a blaze burner. Basically a blaze trapped in a cage, but with no nether dimension, well, it's safe to say that blazes are in short supply. Thankfully, I did know of one place where I could find some. Once again, I was gonna have to do a little moon exploration because I was told by someone that that's where you can find some blazes. I made a little pit stop at the oxygen loader just to collect some air. Once my suit had some oxygen, I put it on, and then I went into the portal wondering where exactly I was gonna find these blazes. I knew they spawned on the moon, but I just didn't know where. Thankfully, after a quick Google search, I was able to figure out that they actually spawn in these abandoned pipelines. I had to be extremely careful because I didn't know what else was in there, and thankfully my caution paid off because I saw a wither skeleton wearing a spacesuit. I defeated the skeleton, and then I plunged into the pipe, hoping to find some good stuff, but instead I found even more skeletons. Although there were some loot crates, the loot wasn't phenomenal, but there were some extra supplies I could use for future machines. Once I harvested all of the loot, it was time to go find some blazes, and wouldn't you know it, there was a spawner right at the end of the hall. The first thing I did, aside from getting incinerated, was to mark this area on my map. I then returned back to Earth to go make myself the vessel that would house the blaze. It was a simple iron cage that I had to make with iron rods and iron sheets. To make the iron rods, I used a roller which basically takes iron ingots and rolls them into rods. With all of my materials now gathered, I was able to craft the blaze burner, which allowed me to return to the moon so that I could finally trap the blaze I was going to use to make my brass. All I had to do was right-click it, and like that, we had a blaze! I placed my friend in a brand new home, and then I fed him lots of logs so that I could start melting down the metals and mixing them into the brass alloy that I needed. After that, I was able to pump it into this small smelter and pour all of them. As I was saying, I poured the brass into the stencil and I was able to create my brass ingot. Now that I had that, I was able to craft my funnel, and with the funnel, I was able to apply it to my wheat machine, and now we could successfully filter out any item that wasn't wheat. All I had to do was push the contraption, and like that, it took off, harvesting every single wheat block in its path. Now that I had a steady supply of wheat being harvested, it was time to take it to the next level. I had to convert the wheat into bread, and then with the bread, I was going to convert it into something even better: egg sandwiches. Now, to make egg sandwiches, I have to combine bread with 2 eggs, but first, let's start taking care of our bread situation. I set up an entire system that would grind the wheat into flour, then into dough, and finally, a beautiful loaf of bread. Here's how it works. The machine harvests all of the wheat from the field. Once the wheat is harvested, it goes through the funnels where it's then stored in a chest. After that, it goes into a grindstone where it's ground up into flour. Seeds are separated into a separate container, and then the flour is washed with water to be converted into dough. Once the dough goes through the filter, it goes through a chest, and then it's baked over a fire. The fire then converts it into bread, and then the bread goes into that storage crate where it's ready to be eaten. I call it the bread system. Now that I had the bread automated, it was time to automate some eggs. Thankfully, I had some chickens nearby that were ready to start working for me. I had to set up some chutes because I was going to have the chickens lay eggs into a funnel that would store them automatically into a chest. I would have the chickens lured into this glass pen. Now I just had to figure out how I was going to do that. Thankfully, I had lots of seeds for my bread machine. Now this was going to be a little tricky. After all, it was a large flock of chickens. Thankfully, they were well behaved and I was able to lure them in without any issues. Now that the birds were gone, I renovated their old pen to make a brand new interface where I could harvest eggs. Then I built them a little house because they were being beaten down on by the sun, and well, I'm not an animal. This is, after all, a humane farm, so the chickens, I'm sure they were very happy to see that they now had some shelter over their heads. Back at the bread machine, I added an outer skin, or a facade, to cover up all the machine parts. As for the inside, well, this is what it looks like behind the scenes. You can see all the machine parts as well as the actual harvester itself. I could finally make egg sandwiches, but I just wasn't hungry yet. Plus, I had nowhere to eat it because I was in the middle of renovating my house. I tore up Noah's old farm, seeing as how we weren't going to need it anymore, and like that, the new expansion was halfway done. This entire area was going to be my brand new workshop. I had an atrium in the center, as well as a second floor which I would use to store chests or other builds. Now, it was time to start moving all of the items from the old workshop to the new one, which was going to be powered by a steam engine. Yes, steam engines are extremely useful, especially when you have a lot of machines you need running. So like that, piece by piece, the workshop was finally coming together. New developments require new tech, including the introduction of electricity. Yes, we were going to dabble in the wonderful world of power. And to do that, we were going to need an alternator, a machine that turns rotational power into electrical power. To make one, we needed to make some chips, as well as some capacitors and a bunch of other techie items, but once we had our alternator, we had to add some rotational power. So I built a steam engine, and the way it works is we have a water wheel powering the whole thing, a bucket gets filled with lava, it goes into a blaze burner, and then the steam engine, well, it has power. The power is then added to the alternator, which generates electricity every time it rotates. And like that, we can power machines. But to make the machines, we need silver. Lots of silver. So we were going to have to automate it, and to do that we needed crushing wheels as well as automatic crafters. So I did everything I needed to do to craft the automatic crafting block. Wow, I say crafting a lot. Anyways, I got some brass so that I could make all the pieces I needed to build my setup. After that, I was able to make some brass casings, and then with the brass casings, I was able to convert them into crafting blocks. I took the crafting blocks to make this massive crafting interface, and like that, we were able to automatically craft items, especially bigger items like this crushing wheel. That is a pretty big crafting recipe, and once I applied every single item together, the automatic crafter did its thing and produced the crushing wheels. These wheels were an important component to my silver making machine. Now it was time to move on to the next step, automating another block known as calcite, and for that I needed bone meal, gravel, and lava. Now, how does one get a steady source of bone meal? Well, you gotta get it from a skeleton spawner. Thankfully, there was one spawner right underneath our base. How convenient is that? The plan was simple. I needed to make a mob grinder using only create mod blocks. Well, at least using a lot of create mod blocks. With water wheels acting as power, the belts would come alive and funnel the skeletons down the middle into these crushing wheels, where they would be ground up into bones. Next, the items would pass through a sorting system that would separate the bones from the bullets. Once I had the bones, they would be ground up into bone meal, and like that, all I had to do was figure out a way to get them up to the surface. I went to the moon to go mine some retextured magma blocks, which I converted into regular magma blocks with the help of this mason's workbench. You put the block in, pick the texture you want, and like that, regular magma blocks. I then got some kelp from my kelp farm, and if you don't know what I'm making, well, I'll give you a hint. Elevator. That's right, a water elevator. Yes, I know I could make an elevator with create mod blocks, but why would I do that when we have this simple system already in place? Now that I had the bone meal issue figured out, it was time to automate gravel. That one was going to be easy. With crushing wheels and a simple cobblestone generator, I was going to be able to power this whole simple setup up with a steam engine, and like that, we automated gravel. This is how it works. We have drills at the top breaking cobblestone. The cobblestone falls between the crushing wheels where it's ground up into gravel, and then the gravel, it gets stored in these chests here. Lastly, we had to pump lava, so underneath the setup I added some pipes for the lava to flow into a basin where all the items were gonna meet. I then made a third water elevator to transport the bone meal directly to the surface. And here is where the bone meal is gonna end up. This is a nice little system that will funnel it all away. You see the bones go into the millstone, get crushed into bone meal, they're jettisoned up to the surface where then they go through another funnel of chests, and finally they go into that funnel that takes them up some chutes, and then from the chutes they end up in a basin. All the ingredients are now making contact. Bone meal, gravel, lava, all they have to do is get pressed together and boom, calcite. Automated calcite. Now that we had our source of calcite, we were one step closer to automating silver. The next block I had to produce was limestone. To make limestone, you need lava, dripstone, moon sand, and flint. Good thing we had a flint generator already set up, which was breaking cobblestone, crushing it into gravel, and then the gravel was stored in a chest before it was washed by water, and sometimes when you wash gravel with water, you have a small chance of generating an iron nugget. Other than that, we had our flint being generated and filtered down to the bottom, where it was put into a basin. As for the dripstone, well, to make dripstone you have to pour water over calcite, which we already had a steady supply of, and once the block is converted, it gets stored in a crude storage unit. There it stays until the basin is ready to receive it along with the flint and lava. The only thing missing now of all the ingredients is moon sand. To make moon sand, it's actually pretty simple. A regular generator consists of only lava and water, but if the lava and water touch above moonstone, well, they make even more moonstone. I had a setup of drills breaking the moonstone, and they could be collected either via minecart down below, or they could enter these chests I had up here. Sometimes they would get ejected into the funnel, and the funnel would put them into the storage unit. Then they'd go down the chutes and into the storage below. Or they'd wait until they'd finally go over some lava that would turn them into smooth stone, then they would be crushed into moon sand and transported upward. The moon sand then goes down the funnel, which leads directly into the basin, where it's then pressed together with the dripstone and flint and lava to finally make the limestone block. Now that we had limestone, all that was left to do was to crush it between crushing wheels. The limestone powder is then transferred into another storage unit where it awaits further processing. We finally had lime dust. This was the entire setup just to get lime dust. But what about the silver? Well, to get silver you wash lime dust. It's better if I show you. So I collected some dust, and then I went to the workshop to wash it with water. And once the washing was complete, all that was left were these nuggets of silver and silver ore. From 4 stacks of dust, I only got 9 pieces of silver. So yeah, the trade-off wasn't great, and honestly, I don't know if this machine was worth it, but it's automated silver. What can I say? It was time to get organized because now we were going to start working on some newer tech which required me to craft batteries, as well as connectors because we were going to dabble again with electricity, specifically power lines. So you can connect power lines between 2 connectors, but that was just one part of a larger tree that we had to follow involving brand new tech. At our disposal was a brand new block known as a grinder. All we had to do was connect it with a wire and power instantly surged into the machine, bringing it to life. All we had to do was put some items in to see if it actually ran. So I got some wheat, threw it in there, and it processed it into flour. The trade-off was amazing, and now we had our first electric machine. To craft more advanced blocks, I was going to need more copper wire, which required me to get more copper for my copper machine. although it was a little outdated and the setup needed an overhaul, so I dismantled it piece by piece to begin something brand new. An upgraded version with brand new components like the crushing wheels. With the crushing wheels added, we could process more blocks, automating even more copper. Cobblestone would be broken down into gravel, and then it would be broken up into sand. Once we had sand, it would be deposited onto a depot where it'd be washed with water until finally the sand was washed away and all that was left would be clay. The clay was melted and then poured over stone, turning it into seared stone, which then traveled through some storage units until it ended up in a basin. Lava would pour over the stone, converting it into viridium, and then the viridium would be ground into copper. The copper chunks then needed to be processed into ore, but that's about it. Now we were unbound. We could craft anything in the skill tree, and our first task was to craft a compressor, another one of those advanced blocks. With the compressor, well, it compresses things. Let's check it out. I went to my workstation, placed the block down, and plugged it in with a wire. After that, I let the power flow in, and the machine came to life, turning ingots into plates. But these machines were so basic. If we wanted to craft more advanced blocks, then we needed a basic machine frame, and to do that we needed more copper casings as well as andesite casings. That's right, we were finally going to build a casing factory. The first thing I did was lay down the foundation of what would be a large building. I also placed down some dirt because I was going to be making a brand new tree farm, one specifically dedicated to creating more andesite casings. I set up the basic contraption with deployers and saws, then I built a second andesite alloy machine. Here I could produce andesite alloys and have them ready for all the logs that were about to be harvested by my tree harvester. Trees would grow, and then they would get chopped down by the harvester. After that, the logs would be put onto a conveyor belt where they would travel down until they were met with the andesite alloy. But first they had to be stripped of their bark with a saw, and once they were clean, they would then move down and be placed with an andesite alloy. Combining them together makes an andesite casing. And now we had to upgrade that casing into a copper casing, which required more machines. To make a copper casing, you need lots of copper sheets. I put the sheets into the deployers along with some rubber, and then the deployers would place the items onto the casings, converting them into copper casings. Like that, we had a steady supply of the next one. It was time for one final upgrade, which required melted silver. It also required 4 balls of rubber, and once they were combined together, they would make a basic machine frame. We finally had a setup that produced one of each casing. Such a grand setup required an even grander structure to house it all, so I began construction on this massive frame that would shelter everything I've built. Come to think of it, I think this is the first official factory we've actually made in this city. It didn't take long, and eventually the building was complete. A beautiful build reminiscent of our first Palace of Progress back in the industrial paradise. Now, in my opinion, the outside is pretty breathtaking, but the inside leaves a lot to be desired. It's really hollow, but we'll fill it with more machines eventually. Next, our journey took us to the moon, because now if we wanted to power these machines effectively, we were going to need a new source of lava. Thankfully, the moon had these massive lava pools we could pump from. That is, if the moon men would let us. Carefully avoiding any hazards, I began building a pipeline that would siphon up all the lava. I made a portal to transfer it into the overworld, and it would all be powered by a windmill. Well, here is the final setup. The longest pipeline I've ever made. Here's how it works. Empty buckets go into the moon portal, they come out the other end still empty, and they circle around where they wait for the lava to be pumped up to the surface and into the buckets. Now the full buckets go back into the portal so that they can enter the overworld, and now they travel around until they come to a fluid spout where they empty themselves. The lava travels through a pipeline into some really large tanks, and then it's pumped all the way to our town. With my factories now powered, I can move on to my next pursuit of making a wire mill. The wire mill, well, it makes wire, and the reason I needed more wire was because look at these machines. They need cables to be powered. Electricity was an expensive pursuit, but I think it's going to be worth it in the end, especially with the addition of these accumulators. They're basically giant car batteries. I mean, come on, these look identical to car batteries. Don't throw them in the ocean. Anyways, these accumulators were excellent ways of transferring power, especially when you're making a moon base and you need oxygen being made. If I was going to build a moon base, then it had to be in style with only the finest of blocks, that being basalt. I used a mason's workbench to retexture them into something futuristic, and well, this is what I came up with for the floor. After that, I went to the moon to go begin building the foundation of this brand new moon base. Hopefully we could get this place up and running so that I could finally install the oxygen machine. A nice glass dome at the top, because what's a moon base without a glass dome? And it kinda looks like Sandy's tree dome from SpongeBob, but you know what? Sandy was a pioneer, and so are we. The final addition I had to make to this moon base was an airlock, a door to keep all the air from being sucked out, and to do that I needed steel. To make steel, you first have to make steel dust, and you start by grounding up some coal. Once the coal was ground up, I took the powder, combined it with iron, and made steel dust. The only problem was that you have to melt it with the superheated blaze burner, and for that you need a blaze cake made with blaze blood. That's right, blaze blood, which could only be acquired by killing blazes in a smeltery setup. The first step was to create an automated source of basalt. Thankfully, I already had that over at the moon sand machine. Basalt was a byproduct, and well, all I had to do was grind it up to make magma cream, an item being the sole reason I had to have basalt to begin with. Once I had my magma cream, it would stay there stored until I needed it for later. With that being automated, it was time to move on to the next item, scoria. To get that block, I could either smelt soul sand in a furnace, or I could simply go to the moon to mine it. It was a naturally occurring block, so I opted to do that instead. Now the reason I needed all of these items was because I had to make scorched grout. Now that block was the only one I could use to make an actual smelter setup. So here's the complete recipe. Scoria, soul sand, powdered obsidian, and magma cream. Throw them all in a basin and you get scorched grout. Throw the grout in some lava and you get scorched bricks, the item we needed to craft our setup. Now that we had that, all we had to do was melt down some obsidian, make a scorched brick block, and then I poured the melted obsidian over the block to make a smeltery controller. This was the brain of the entire smeltery. And now it was simply a matter of crafting all the other components until we could finally build our setup. Next stop, blaze blood. But first, I was going to have to make some brand new lights because torches burn out in the moon. No oxygen, but these lights, they were perfect. I went back to the same pipeline where I had first encountered the blazes, and then I placed a bunch of lights down to ensure my safety, and after that, well, I dashed in like a madman, placing as many blocks as I could without getting killed in the process. Eventually, I was able to enclose the spawner in the smeltery setup, and like that I threw some lava in, powered it up, and the blazes began dying. The whole thing was filling with blaze blood. I got a bucket, scooped up a sample for myself. It was time to bake a cake. I had to make a quick escape because the Moon Man was not happy with what I was doing to his blaze friends, but when I got home, I made some netherrack by throwing soul sand into a soul fire. That converts it into netherrack, and then from there I had to ground it down into netherrack powder. I think that's what it's called. With the netherrack powder, I poured water over it, converting it into cinder flour. And with the cinder flour, I made a blaze cake base, which I immediately filled with the blaze blood. And now I had a bucket of fuel, and it didn't work. Because guess what? It doesn't work in this mod. For that, we had to go to Chapter 4. So, I guess the moon base was gonna have to wait because we weren't gonna be able to make steel for our airlock. But that's okay, we have other projects to work on, like building a rocket. And to make a rocket, you have to craft fuel, you have to craft the launch pad, and well, to make the launch pad, we need concrete. Blast-proof concrete. Just the thing you need to launch a rocket, and to do that we need a bunch of stuff. But the first item we're going to focus on is making your regular Minecraft concrete. You know, sand, gravel, bone meal to make your dyes, we just gotta make concrete powder. Once we had the concrete powder, we had to get some limestone. Then I had to get some coal dust, and once I had that, I placed down my sink to gather some water, and once I got my steel dust, I combined all the ingredients together to make this wet, blast-proof concrete. After that, I put it in the small smeltery setup and poured it out to make the concrete blocks. And well, here's the result. A very sturdy piece of stone, perfect for rocket launches. Now that I had my blast-proof concrete, all I had to do was place it in the mechanical crafter, and all the machine parts brought it together to form this launch pad. The launch pad we'd use to go to, you guessed it, Mars. Look at the size of that thing. The next step was to create the rocket assembler itself. This was called a NASA workbench, and to make a NASA workbench, we needed dash, capacitors, mechanical arms, as well as a navigation mechanism. Now, to make a navigation mechanism, we were going to have to start by collecting cobalt, which could only be found on the moon. So I went to the moon with the hopes of finding a nice supply, which is what I did, and once I mined the cobalt, I collected an ample sum, went back to the overworld, but not before killing this moon man, and I mean, wow, look at that cavern. That is a big cavern. Anyways, I took the cobalt and melted it down into molten form, and once the cobalt was melted, I filled up a bucket because we were going to use the molten cobalt to make this navigation mechanism, but not before making electrum, basically another type of metal. Now to make electrum, we have to take melted dash and electrocute it with a Tesla coil. Something out of the future, really. Now, the Tesla coil was pretty easy to craft. I first started off by making some copper cables. Once I had the cables, I then went to go make some copper wiring to make a copper spool. You know, wire wrapped around a spool. Like that, I was able to craft the Tesla coil. Now I just had to figure out how it worked. There weren't any buttons, but when I put a lever down, it activated and, well, I got electrocuted. After that, it was simply a matter of figuring out how to electrocute the items. But not before I discovered the need to upgrade this area, which I wanted to dub my laboratory because I found myself doing more sciencey stuff here. So I replaced the roof with some glass, and after that, I added this futuristic facade on the side. That way we wouldn't have to worry about phantoms or other mobs getting in. With the little side project now behind me, it was time to get back to work. We had to electrocute Desh. So I filled some buckets with Desh, and then I took the melted item, which lacked a texture. I have no idea why, but you know what? I was able to look past it. I took the item and I put it on a depot where it got electrocuted by the Tesla coil, and eventually the Desh was converted into electrum. We now had molten electrum, which we could use and turn it into block form. Although my work with the Tesla coil wasn't done. I found out that I could actually create redstone if I made these synthetic crystals and charged them up. To begin, I crafted myself a new mode of transportation known as a gyrodyne. It's basically a helicopter with wings. I hop into the boat, I pedal it like a bicycle, and well, take a look. I am now flying. This is a fun little way to get around, and well, it was perfect because I had to begin my quest for a rose bush, one of the ingredients I needed if I wanted to make my synthetic redstone crystals. And the reason I needed the rose bushes was because I wanted the red dye, which could be combined with glass to form the synthetic crystal. With the crystals now in my hand, I took them to the Tesla coil to charge them up and see how the redstone process would work. And yeah, it made redstone. Knowing that this works, I went to my skeleton grinder area to automate the rose bushes. I needed more dye to make more crystals, so I was going to have to create an entire new setup underground. This whole area was going to be dedicated to creating redstone, so I added some extra belts along with some cogs to create a brand new setup. This setup was pretty simple, although it looked kind of ugly underground, so I added some finishing touches, you know, just to make it look a little nicer. I hope you guys like the design, and I gotta say, it is a huge step up from, you know, the cave thing that we had going on earlier. Anyways, let me show you how this whole thing works because this is probably one of my favorite machines. So, we have a bunch of bone meal here, obviously that's from our grinder, and I couldn't automate the rose bushes, so I would just click on them. Once I had the dye, I went behind the wall to supply the machine with the dye. The dye would then be put in an automatic crafter, being combined with glass, which was also being produced behind the wall, to make the synthetic crystal. The synthetic crystal would be stored until it was ready to be charged by the Tesla coil, which would then convert the crystal into redstone dust. I was gonna leave it there to save it for later because now I had to make quartz, and the first step to making quartz was by collecting lots of basalt. Once I had the basalt, I had to make some soul sand, which I was able to do by throwing regular sand into soul fire. I melted the soul sand in the smelter to make liquid soul, and then I poured the liquid soul over the basalt to make diorite. Once you have diorite, all you have to do is take it to some crushing wheels, have it ground up, and sometimes there is a chance that the diorite will drop quartz, which was just what I needed. I went back to go get some redstone, which was accumulating by this point, and with the redstone, I combined it with the quartz to make this rose quartz. I was able to sand it down with some sandpaper, put some rose gold on it, and now I had electron tubes. With the electron tubes, I put them on the belt and I had them converted into those redstone microchips you saw in the last video, and now it was time for the navigation mechanism. To do this, I was going to have to melt down the cobalt, have it stored in a spout, or it would then be deposited onto the chips. After that, an electron nugget would be applied, and then it would be stamped, and it had to do it 30 times! 30 times going around until I finally had the navigation mechanism. A lot of work for a little chip, but I think it's going to be worth it because we were one step closer to crafting our NASA workbench. But first I had to do some organizing. I crafted a bunch of chests, these ones being upgraded versions of the default ones, and well, the better the ore, the better the chest. The iron chest has a ton of space in it, and it was just what I needed because I was running out of room. With my whole storage area now retrofitted, I organized all of my items, got the last of the required materials for my NASA workbench. All I had to do now was place them all into the mechanical crafter, and like that, they were combined to form the most expensive thing I've made yet, the NASA workbench. And that's to be expected because you know what? It's used for making rockets. And check this out. Is that an interface or what? This was a beautiful looking block. They went above and beyond when designing it, but now we had to make fuel for our ship. And to do that, we had to get seed oil, and that was pretty simple because we had a massive supply of seeds. All I had to do was let the machine run, it would collect the seeds, and when it got back, there were plenty of seeds to be had. The seeds were stored in a crate there, which I was able to easily access, and the next step was to actually construct a refinery, and I was thinking across the river to do that. So I collected a bunch of stone that was just excess from all of my machines because they weren't that optimal. And once I collected as much stone as I needed, I went across the river to begin building what would be the brand new refinery for our rocket fuel. This refinery was going to be the first in a new line of futuristic buildings. After all, I was getting tired of this log cabin feel that we had going on, and it just didn't really match the aesthetic of the progress we aimed to achieve. So I began using stone and a bunch of other strong materials to create the first part of this fuel process, a moss block farm. And don't ask me for the design, I got it off of YouTube because it didn't really rely on create blocks. So yeah, this whole thing is responsible for getting moss blocks. Bunch of redstone goes into it. I mean, if I wanted to explain it to you, I would, but I just don't know how it works. Anyways, I covered it up, and this was the facade of the fuel refinery. Now I had to take the moss blocks and actually turn them into fuel. But don't worry, we're gonna get there. Now, as of right now, the main goal was gonna be using the plant oil, which I would store in that tank right there, and I had to combine it with moss carpet, which I was making with the moss blocks. This was gonna create something called a plant ball, and well, that was the first item we needed on our way to making rocket fuel. Now, to make the plant ball, the items had to be joined together in a basin and mixed with a mixer. Once they were joined together, the plant ball would be produced, and then it would move down the line to make another green mass, and well, that's what the plant ball looks like. Time to convert it into the next thing. There's me putting logs into the fire so that the plant balls are being made. The next step is to stamp them 4 times to make compressed plant balls, and well, once you have a compressed plant ball, you have to press it even more to make something called a biomass. Once you have the biomass, the next step is to wash it with water to convert it into something called pure biomatter. So I set up a little water fan setup, that way we could wash the biomass down to make our biomatter. And once the biomatter was complete, all I had to do was put it in a can, and like that, we had rocket fuel. Honestly, I have no idea how that works, but yeah, this is what's called a solid canning machine. I crafted it, and this is what we were going to use to can the biomatter. You have to make these little tanks out of tin, and once you have the tanks and the canning machine, all you do is put the tanks in along with the biomatter, and boom, rocket fuel. Now, all we had to do was craft the rocket ship itself. Let's go. Now, before we craft the rocket ship, even though we had the launch pad, we did need a proper launch site. And what better way to launch our rocket than by inaugurating its first flight from a brand new area known as the Launch Center. Now, this launch center was going to be the peak of our technological standing because as of this point, we were finally able to start flying into the stars again. No more cutting corners with moon portals. No, this was technology. I was going to use the basalt to make this nice looking grid-like floor, and the floor was the last thing I had to build because once that was done, the launch center was ready to go. Now, all I had to do was make some egg sandwiches for the long journey ahead, and now we were finally ready to start crafting our rocket. The space was pretty big, plenty of room for this rocket, which was a massive crafting recipe. All I had to do was make the parts using all of the machines I already had. Fans, fins, and a bunch of other tanks, everything you'd think a rocket would need. I put it all in the NASA workbench, and boom, we had a rocket. Now, look at this. I love the 3D model for this thing. It is just so detailed. I rushed to the launch site, placed down the launch pad, and yeah, I know it's not aligned, but you know what? What are you gonna do about it? The rocket was ready for launch. All that was left was to add the fuel and board the rocket itself. And now it was time for the famous countdown. Only seconds left to go, and at last, we had liftoff. The rocket was off the ground, and now it was time to figure out how exactly I was going to select the planet I wanted to head to. Thankfully, they thought of everything with this mod. all of a sudden I was presented with this menu of the galaxy. Within my grasp was the entire solar system, but today we're just gonna stick with Mars. I couldn't wait to see what it looked like. Anyways, we're gonna try again. For some reason, it didn't occur to me that I was landing way too quickly and I actually had to deploy a parachute. Once I gently floated to the surface, well, I learned from my mistake. That's all I can say. I collected the rocket and now, look at that. I was on Mars only to be attacked by the locals. Why is everything so hostile to me? This is why I hate visiting new places. Speaking of new places, I found a structure. And who were the inhabitants? Well, these strange looking aliens that were just retextured piglins. But you know what? I shouldn't say that because that ruins the immersion. They were called pygros. And well, they didn't want me there. So I ran away to what looked like a village. Inside the village, actual piglins. So yeah, nothing was friendly to me, but that wasn't going to stop me from looting all the stuff, even if it meant breaking a few eggs along the way. Now that I was safe to search the area, I began inspecting the chests, only to find lots and lots of gold. These piglins were rich, and they even had piglin coins, so they were far more evolved than the ones from the Nether. Then I was attacked by this gross-looking bug-like creature, and well, I decided to see what natural occurrences Mars had, like this lead ore. I knew we were going to need lead for something, so I collected as much as I could carry. Now, my only limiting factor to my time here, oh, I forgot I collected that wither skull. Like I said, my only limiting time here was the oxygen that I had, so I had to be quick about mining all of these brand new ores. There were also some ice shard ores as well as a brand new ore called Astral, but my oxygen was low, so I had to go. And no, that was not meant to rhyme. I got into the rocket, I blasted off into space, and now it was finally time to go look over my loot. But first, why not build a space station? Looked pretty cheap to build. So I landed safely on Earth, no explosions this time, and I began collecting the materials I needed to build a brand new space station. What I was going to do with it, I have no idea, but you know what? The fact that it was available to me meant that I simply had to do it. First, I smelted all of my brand new Mars ores to explore what they could do for me. Lead, Astral. I didn't know what I was going to use them for yet, so stored them for later. After that, I collected all the materials I needed to make my space station. I even had to make some more rocket fuel for the next trip. Once the space station was built, because it builds it for you once you have all the items, all I had to do was explore it, and well, this place was pretty cool. There were some iron doors, which I'm guessing were the airlocks that I wanted to craft earlier. Interesting that they showed up here. As for the inside, I wasn't sure if I was able to take off my helmet, so I kept it on not knowing if there was oxygen, but the space was kinda small. Not much going on aside from the really cool moon globe, and there were some places to sit. In a separate area, I spotted something extremely interesting, an oxygen distributor being powered by a solar panel. This led me to believe that this area did have oxygen, so I decided to take my helmet off and look at that, I wasn't dying. I wanted to test the limits of how far the oxygen spread, so I decided to walk around all over the space station. I even opened up the airlock, which was a horrible idea. Once I closed it, I was able to gather my composure once again, but yeah, I spun the moon globe around just to kill some time, and I was getting kind of bored, so I left this beautiful space station and went back to Earth. The rocket had liftoff, and from there we returned to our beautiful green world. Once we had made our second successful landing, I began moving on to the next project, but not before eating this crusty bread. I wanted to take a break from making technology and instead explore the culture of Mars from the piglins. And to do that, we were going to have to craft some effigies. These little gold effigies were easy to make. All we had to do was turn some gold nuggets into these tiny little gold pins. Then once we had the gold pins, we had to put a gold bar onto the conveyor belt where the gold pins would be applied, and that would convert the gold bar into this little piglin effigy. Take a look. Kinda looks like a totem of undying, although it's way more useless. The next step is, well, they want you to look up piglin inflation. Do not look up piglin inflation. No, the next step is to combine pork chops, iron, and gold to make pig steel, and as bizarre as it sounds, well, that's because it is. You end up with this pink slurry-like solution which you can mold into metals and weapons and armor, and honestly, I don't know why this is a thing, but it is. You end up with a pig plate which you have to combine with paper to make this piglin banner template. And once you have the banner template, I guess guess it's kind of like forged documents which you take to the Piglin so that they accept you into their society. I don't know how it works, and I don't know who made this quest line, but please get help. I decided to leave Piglin culture alone and go back to making technology. The next step was to make electrified pins. To do this, we had to make gold pins like we did when we were making the effigies. I threw some nuggets into a rolling machine, made the pins, brought them to the Tesla coil so they could get charged up, and they were kinda taking a while, so I decided to leave them alone and move on to the other step, that being making an Astral plate. Astral being an ore I mined on Mars. I put it into the compressor, it made some plates, and by the time that was done, the pins were ready. We could finally move on to making the next chip, but not before upgrading our storage system with applied Energistics. I've always avoided this mod because of how complicated it seems, but after watching a lengthy number of YouTube tutorials, I think I was finally prepared to do this. The first step was to collect presses, which were basically the stencils used to make all of the other items. Now, I had some of them, but I was missing the rest, and the only way you can find presses is by going to the moon, digging straight into the center of asteroids, and finding them in chests that were located there. Sometimes you could find them in ruins, but in this case I wasn't so lucky. I wandered the moon for what seemed like an eternity, scouring the ruins of every building I came across. I collected other blocks along the way, but like I said, the goal was to find the presses. I found these train ruins, went inside the building that was connected to the train ruins, but yeah, empty. During my hunt, I would always stop to mine some Dash ore because I was running out, and well, I'm telling ya, when I say I scoured every building, I scoured every building. I even discovered this brand new wasteland biome where I discovered a new source of magma creams. There were a ton of magma cubes as well as a bunch of slime blocks. And of course, phantoms. Phantoms always have to ruin my day. Thankfully, the sun rose and they went away. Next, it was time to turn my attention to the asteroids. Hopefully they would contain what I needed, but often the case, they did not. But that didn't stop me. I continued to search asteroid after asteroid, finding useless items like silver and the presses that I already had. I even checked to see if you could craft it, but you couldn't. So I continued my search, trying to be as patient as possible, finding more and more useless items until finally I came across this really cool obsidian asteroid, and inside, what I needed. The inscriber silicon press. And thank God, the achievements rolled in, and now I could finally go back home to upgrade my storage. The next step was to make silicon itself. To do this, I was gonna have to make Certus quartz dust, which I could use by grinding Certus quartz in a millstone. That's what I'd have to do if I didn't already have a small stockpile of the stuff. All I had to do was throw it into the lava fan, and from there it converted into silicon. I collected the items, and wow, that is an achievement name. Okay, well, anyways, I was gonna start making more of the chips. Unfortunately, I realized that this thing needed power. So I was gonna have to make a little trip to the laboratory where we had our prototype set up for the energy generator, and once I placed it down, I connected it all with wires. Now I could finally use the inscriber. So it's pretty simple. You put the press in, some silicon, and like that, it makes you a chip. Now, I was gonna have to make a lot of these chips because there were many different variations, like the Certus quartz chip. All I had to do was put some Certus quartz in, and like that, it would produce me one of the chips, and it was a little bluer than the gray ones that you're used to. You could also make a diamond chip, and well, you can tell that these are all tiered, diamond being the best, gold being kind of in the middle, and Certus quartz being at the bottom. But now we had to make shimmer dust. Now, shimmer dust was pretty easy. All you had to do was place some shimmer above some Certus quartz dust, and we had lots of shimmer from the previous video. So that's what I continued doing for the next few minutes, just making more shimmer dust. And once I had that, I combined it with the chips to make these super chips. And well, these chips are basically upgraded versions, and they were going to be extremely useful for future crafting recipes. Now we could start moving on to the more nitty-gritty stuff, cables. You see, you gotta transfer data somehow, and the data has to travel through cables, which is exactly why we needed the shimmer dust to begin with. You start off by crafting this low-tier cable called a quartz fiber. Once you have the fiber, well, you gotta upgrade it to an actual cable. That's where the shimmer dust comes into play. Once you have your new cables, you can actually combine them together to make even denser cables to transfer even more data. But to do that, you have to shear some sheep, because in order to make those fully upgraded cables, you're gonna need wool. Now, I don't know where the wool comes into play. I think it kind of counts as a plastic overlay, because now you have this extra thick layer above your original cable. But yeah, then you make them super dense by combining them into this like ultra cable. And in case you were wondering, here is a side-by-side comparison. We have the dense covered cable, and then we have the next cable, that being the Shimmer ME glass cable, and last but not least, the smallest of them all, the quartz fiber. So yeah, the cable's organized by order. Now it was time to make the blocks. We're going to make what's called an ME controller as well as an energy cell, and these are basically going to make up the bulk of our storage system. I had to start off by making some quartz glass, and once I had my quartz glass, I was able to craft an energy acceptor. This basically acts as a means of transferring energy into all of my machines. I also had to make this energy cell because it was going to be used in multiple crafting recipes, including the creation of an ME controller. With a bucket of shimmer, I poured it over the energy cell, and it took a while, but it finally made an ME controller. This is basically the brain of the entire storage system. With these 3 blocks, we could accomplish anything with storage. The next item to tackle was crafting an ME drive, and that makes sense because if you're going to store things, then you need hard drives, and this was going to store all of those hard drives. All we had to do was make the drives themselves. And there were a lot of variations to choose from with different storage capacities. With my new blocks, it was time to begin the storage setup, and the indication that it was receiving power was because the block went RGB mode on me. Upon closer inspection, I saw exactly how much power was surging into the whole system. I right-clicked it only to find a menu to see all the blocks that were connected. The next step was to craft an ME interface, and to do that I had to craft 2 types of cores. Now, these 2 cores, the formation core and the annihilation core, they made up the interface, which was basically the base to make all touchscreens for the storage system. Once I had the interface, I made an ME storage bus which I could connect to a chest. Now, I know that's a lot, I mean look at this progress tree, but it gets pretty simple. Now I had to make the touchscreen itself, and once I was able to craft this crafting screen, all I had to do was combine it with the crafting table to make it functional. You can place it down and there's nothing there because it's not active. But yeah, there's the ME drive connected to the ME controller. I connected it with the cable so that it could divert power to the storage unit, and now the chest was connected to the storage system. All I had to do was place the terminal there, and well, now we could interact with items in the chest that was on the left. Only this time, we could actually craft. See, this is a regular iron chest right here. I'm putting in items, but if I interact with the terminal, the items show up there, as well as a crafting interface. Complicated, which is why I've avoided this mod for years, but you'll get the hang of it eventually. The next task was very simple. All I had to do was craft myself some storage drives so that I could actually increase the chest capacity, and these drives were basically made up with these little star components, and that's how you increase the storage capacity. I had to make more of these star components to upgrade the storage capacity, and for my first drive I ended up creating one that could hold 4,000 items. So yeah, simple storage, but not really. So here are all the components that are active, and that's all the power being used to keep it running. And now it was time to craft the wireless terminal, a device that allows you to access any of your chests wherever you are in your Minecraft world. How useful is that? So I gathered the rest of my items, brought them back to the laboratory, and began organizing them because I was going to craft myself the wireless terminal. I crafted that purple ender pearl, and then I already had all the components, so making this was a breeze. But trying to figure out how to get it working, that was going to be a little tricky. You see, I didn't know how to link the device, and it had no power, so I crafted a charger thinking, hey, maybe that would fix it. And well, the charging process took way too long. I decided to connect it to the generators directly, and even that took forever. I then figured out that, hey, maybe I should probably upgrade the cables that I'm using, because at this point I was just using the lowest level of cable, copper. What if I were to upgrade them into something else? Well, guess what? You can. All it takes is some rubber and some silver, and like that, you can make the highest tier of cables. Now, these cables were going to be able to transfer a larger amount of electricity than the simple copper cable, so I ran all of the cables throughout the entire laboratory, even used it to connect it to the storage system, and like that, more power was surging in. The cables were doing their job. Now, with that, the charger was finally ready to be used, but it still wasn't working. That's because I had to craft an ME chest, which was one of the main components for making a security terminal. Now, you have to link the device to a security terminal, and because I didn't have one, the device wasn't linking to anything. With that, I applied the wireless terminal, and it linked. Now it was time to see if it worked. With the device linked, I was ready to access my storage from anywhere, but now it was telling me that the device was out of range. At least until I added what was called an access point. Now a signal was being sent and the device could be accessed from a certain radius, although if I wanted to expand the distance to which I could access my chests, I had to craft another item. That item is called a wireless booster, and for good reason. It basically boosts the range for which you can access all of your items. The more chips, the larger the range. Just make sure you have enough power to keep the whole thing running. With my storage now set up, I could finally get back to making more components to further my interests in this technological world. The deployer applied the electrified pins, and once it was done, we finally ended up with what looked like a CPU. You know, that chip that controls your computer. I think that's what it does. I'm not a geek on that stuff. Anyways, there we go. All I had to do was apply the Astral plate and it would finally be complete. The first of many high-tier chips. We had an advanced integrated circuit, and this thing was expensive to make, but for good reason, because it could make us the advanced technology. And such tech was going to require even more power for our cables, so it was time to design a new power plant. One that generated electricity. I went to go gather some iron to craft iron blocks because I was going to make an old friend that I had heavily relied on in the last Create series, that being a schematic cannon. If you don't know what a schematic cannon does, it's basically a machine that takes a blueprint with the design and then it builds it for you so long as you supply it with all the blocks. And like that, the schematic cannon began building my power plant that I designed in a separate creative world. While it did that, it was time to leave it alone and explore other aspects of this skill tree. Like, for example, I had a lot of stuff to do, like upgrading my laboratory. You see, the laboratory I had right now was kind of small, so I decided to start filling in this lake with moon sand, Lord knows I had a lot of it, to dig a massive hole. The reason I was digging this hole was because I was going to build a multi-leveled lab. Now, to do this, I had to have the finest shovel, and well, this iron shovel wasn't doing it anymore. Look at that, 0.4 mining speed. So I upgraded it to a cobalt, which was a little faster, and when you speed it up, it's super fast, so yeah. Once the hole was done, I began outlining it with this smooth stone, and then from there, oh my goodness, that almost killed me. I decided to continue extending the sidewalk so that it would circle around the massive hole. I used stone slabs because you know what, when you use slabs, you get more out of every block. And once the path was finally complete and I thought it looked really nice and clean, I went down to the hole itself and I broke up every block that was in stone, replacing it with stone. The idea was to make the walls look like they were created with concrete, and I think I was able to accomplish that with all the stone. Next, it was time to finally dig into the wall itself to start carving out the laboratory. But first, let's check out the power plant. It was finally complete. Hope you guys like the design. I added some water to get the machines warmed up, but we'll come back to this later. Right now, we have to build a lab. So I went back to the hole and began carving out what would be a giant space in the wall. When I was digging the hole, I didn't really actually have a plan aside from breaking blocks. For starters, I had no idea how large I wanted this room to be, so I just winged it and stopped when I felt it was an appropriate size. After that, I began working on an outline for the window that would overlook the hole, and this was going to be the first level of multiple levels. We would have multiple rows of windows, but for now, we're just sticking with one. As you can see, I started working on a staircase so that we could actually access the laboratory, and I added some stone and cobblestone to make it the stairs themselves. Could have picked a futuristic looking block, but stone and cobblestone, they look nice. And now for the power plant. How exactly does it work? Well, let me show you. Down here is the source of power for the machines themselves. Water is pumped up, it goes into the storage tank. We have the generators here that aren't active yet. So to actually bring the whole thing to life, I had to power one more water wheel, and like that, everything was up and running now. Water was being pumped into the storage tank. As you can see, it's rising there, and there is the tank itself. As for the blaze burners, we had multiple buckets of lava circling around. They were connected to our lava source, which we had created earlier, and they were being fed into the blaze burners by a mechanical arm. The mechanical arm would put them in, and when they were full, it would just put them onto a depot just to circle them around again. And there are the engines. We had multiple engines powering multiple generators, and like that, we had generated enough power for our laboratory. And here are some accumulators that I wanted to use to test how much power was being generated. I connected them with some cables, although for some reason, these accumulators were a little buggy. Sometimes when they would collect energy, they would stop at 512. I don't know why, but I swapped out the other cable and it was still 512. So yeah, I was just gonna leave them alone and hope that it was a display glitch and that they were actually generating power, and they were. 22K, look at that. With the power plant up and running, it was finally time to complete the laboratory, so I went to go collect some iron because I was gonna craft myself a very fancy futuristic light source. The iron was smashed into sheets, and the reason I needed sheets was because I was going to make these blue lights, these glowing iron pillars. To install these on the ceiling, I crafted myself what was called a quadrocopter. The best way to describe it is that it kind of looks like a drone that you can sit on, but the only reason I made this item was because the item description said it was only good for building. It's not very fast and it kind of just hovers around, so we're gonna see how well this goes. I added some wood to fuel it up and it wasn't that fast, although it did look pretty cool. And I went straight to the laboratory. I descended down into the hole, and you know what, now that I look at it, it's kind of slow, a little too slow, but aside from it being slow, another drawback about this thing was that when it comes to building and getting into those little nooks and crannies, which is exactly what I had to do, this thing was very finicky. Sometimes I would phase into a block and just start suffocating, and that was so annoying. Watch, check this out. I'm placing the blocks here, and there you go. In the end, I decided to just place them normally the way the good Notch intended, block by block, on foot, and this was the result. A futuristic, sleek-looking design that was only the beginning of what would be a prosperous laboratory. Now, with that out of the way, I decided to clean it up a little more. Here's a larger view. And the next task to complete the room was to fill in the massive round window that was behind me. So I experimented with different colors of glass, but in the end I opted for the light blue stained glass, just because it matched with the lighting that I had going on. So yeah, once the glass was installed, I backed up to admire the entire setup here. I even added some extra wall panels on the side so that we could have more light, and it just looks so clean. This was the perfect place to start placing my machines. There's the outside. Look at it, like something out of Star Wars. Here I am walking around admiring the whole thing, and now it was finally time to start connecting some power into this place because we had to start delving into more tech. So I got some copper cables from the power station and began relaying them all the way to the laboratory. Once the cables were installed, I added some accumulators to test the power, and everything was running as it should. And thank goodness, because we had a lot to tackle in this progress tree. But before we get ahead of ourselves, it's time to go back into Piglin culture. As strange as that questline was, I just had to complete it. So I went back to the launch site, placed the rocket down, and began filling it up with fuel because I was gonna pay a visit to the Piglin village. I went into the rocket, initiated the countdown sequence, and we were off, finally returning for our next Mars excursion. I had the Piglin effigies, I had the Piglin papers. It was finally time to see if these items were actually useful or if this was just a complete waste of time. I made a soft landing now that I know I had to hold my spacebar down when descending, and I was off looking for the Piglin village. I went around eating some bread, and then after that I found myself there at my destination. As for the Piglins themselves, it looked like a ghost town. I didn't know where anybody was until finally I came across one guy who was just staring at me. I wasn't wearing any gold armor, but because I had the Piglin effigy in my hand, he was friendly. I then threw him the counterfeit Piglin papers we had made, and he just kind of stared at me, holding them in his hand. No reaction there until I gave him a coin. Once I gave him a coin, everything changed. He thoroughly examined that thing, checking to make sure if it was counterfeit or not, and then he paid me with copper. This was a massive breakthrough for Minecraft social science because today I learned you could actually scam the piglins with fake gold coins. Yeah, you could actually craft the gold coins with the counterfeit papers. I just learned that as I'm recording this voiceover, but I went around trading all of the fake coins to every piglin I could find, and they paid me generously. Well, you know what, strike that. They weren't that generous. They were giving me junk, but you know what, it was still cool. I tried to get back, but this little pig kept attacking me. I got into the rocket and initiated the launch, and once I blasted off, the pig was fried. That's what you get for standing in the launch site. It was time to descend back to Earth because I had finally finished my pig study, and now it was time to get back to some serious work. It was time to add some tech to the laboratory, so I added all the machines I had already crafted and let the power flow into them. Now, these machines were just the first stepping stones into making a lot of other machines. I even added some more Tesla coils, which I had crafted because I had the intent of making more of those fancy microchips, and to do that, well, Tesla coils were essential. With the coils up and running, I could charge up to 5 stacks of pins at a time, and that was efficient in my eyes because that meant I could craft more of those fancy microchips. I also had to install deployers and mechanical presses, but my main priority was crafting more of the basic chips, and to do that I needed a lot of Certus quartz. Now, to make Certus quartz, you have to soak a seed in water for 20 minutes. So it was time to go outside and make an automatic Certus quartz farm. Once I had the Certus quartz farm up and running, I was going to be able to make more of the advanced chips, and we'd be well on our way to making good technology. I added all of the components, and this here is the final setup. This is how it works. Certus quartz goes down the belt and into a funnel, and it's split into 2 spots. The first spot takes it up to the top where it's ground up into Certus quartz dust. The dust then goes into a funnel, which puts it in an automatic crafter where it's combined with sand. With the sand and dust combined, it becomes a Certus quartz seed, which is then dropped into some water below where it soaks for 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, the seed grows into a crystal, and once it's in crystal form, the crystal comes out of the funnel, goes through the same belt, and this time it's split off into a storage unit there where I can collect it for later. That is the setup, and I covered it with a wall, and yeah, now we had an automatic supply of Certus quartz, which meant we could craft a lot more microchips. The time had come to finally make those chips, so I decided to convert some wire into cables, and once I had the cables, I crafted all the chips I needed, and I needed a lot. But like I said before, we needed deployers as well as mechanical presses. And to power that, because we didn't have any water wheels, we were going to use electricity. The power flowed into a block called an electric motor, and the motor would rotate, bringing power to all of the presses and deployers I added. Now with the machines coming to life, I just had to orientate them in the right direction. The deployers now had the pins, and the chips were placed so that those pins could be placed onto them, and now we were beginning the process of making advanced microchips. Once that was done, I added a roller to make more pins, although the machine got overstressed, so I was going to have to remedy that with another electric motor. But first, I had to finish my pin setup here. I converted my gold bars into nuggets, and once those nuggets went in, they would come out the bottom as golden pins after being rolled. The next step was to add the Astral plates, which I was able to create with my compressor. The compressor turned the ingots into plates, and then I put the plates in the hands of the deployers, which would then place them onto the chips. And I'm saying a lot of words, I hope you guys are able to keep up, but it's all worth it, trust me, because now I had the next tier of microchips. The next step was to craft an extractor. You use a machine frame and some taps to make one. Once I had that, I had to craft what was called an advanced machine frame, and these were all going to be used to make what was called an industrial electrolyzer. A very complicated block with a lot of complicated purposes. But yeah, I placed it down to give it some power, and now what exactly does the machine do? Let's start with the clay example. I gathered some clay, and then I went back to the laboratory to have it pulverized into clay dust. I went onto the grinder machine and had it broken down, and once we had the dust, it was time to take it to the next level. There's the dust floating there. I had to put it in a can because it was about to be converted into something else. The electrolyzer did its thing, and from the clay dust we got 3 separate items: lithium, sodium, and azurite, but in this case we only wanted the lithium. Reason being was because once you had lithium, you could use it to create the next item, lithium batteries. I set aside the batteries for other machines, but this time I wanted to craft something fun. Guess what we're making? Well, we're crafting some night vision goggles, the perfect tool to have on the darkest of days. I didn't really have a need for them, but you know what? They're night vision goggles. How could I not make them? I had to make some LED lights with some glowstone, as well as some reinforced glass. I threw it all together with some of those advanced chips, and like that, I had a pair of night vision goggles. All I had to do was charge them because they had no power, but they looked really cool when you wear them. So let's give these some power. I went to the charging station and I plugged them in, and they didn't work because they weren't compatible. Thankfully, the Tesla coil did the job. It took only a second, and once they had power, all I had to do was figure out how to activate them. While doing that, I unintentionally provoked an Enderman who was out for blood, so I had to put him down. Thankfully, he wasn't that much of a threat because the cable was in the way, so once again, technology prevailed. With the Enderman out, it was time to test the night vision goggles, and they worked, although looking back on it, I probably should have tested them outside. It was time to see if we could make some steel, and the first thing I needed was an industrial blast furnace, and to make that, I needed an electric furnace, which also depended on me making an iron furnace, so a lot of furnaces to be made here. After I got some cobblestone, I made the first tier, that being the iron furnace, and once I had my iron furnace, and this is what the block looks like, it just looks like a furnace with iron over it. That's to be expected given the name. But once I had the iron furnace, I added a microchip and some Certus coils to make the electric furnace, and with the electric furnace, well, it's not that much different from a regular furnace aside from the fact that it doesn't burn coal. Instead, it uses electricity. It heats up and it's able to smelt all of your ores and cook all of your food with the power of power. So yeah, here's an example. Like that, iron ingots, no coal needed. I took the electric furnaces and I used them to craft the industrial blast furnace, but that wasn't the only thing I had to do if I wanted this thing to get up and running. See, there's the block there, but as you can see, it says incomplete multi-block. Reason being was because there was an entire structure I had to build behind it. So I was gonna have to craft some more blocks and fill the interior with lava. That's right, this industrial blast furnace was more complicated than it seemed. So I crafted the required blocks, and once I had them on hand, I began placing them in accordance with the holographic blueprint that the machine provided for me, and then I filled it with lava. I was one step closer to doing some industrial smelting, and like that, the furnace was ready. So it was time to see what this thing could actually do. To make steel with this machine, one of the first things I had to accomplish was chop down a lot of rubber logs because we had to burn them. Upon acquiring enough logs, I returned to the lab to create another machine known as an industrial centrifuge. It's basically a machine that spins items around and around and around really fast. In this case, we had to spin the logs around. So I let power surge into the machine, and once it was ready to go, I added the items, the logs and the cans included, and it spun around all of those items and a bunch of other items, those including a methane cell, the sap, and of course the carbon cell. Now the carbon cell is what we wanted, because we had to combine it with this molten iron, which I also collected. Once I combined the molten iron and the carbon cell together, the result was steel dust, but we still had to melt it. Unfortunately, I was all out of time. Day 100 had finally creeped up on me, although I did feel that I had a little moment to spare for one more excursion. You see, if I was going to succeed in taking back the moon base, and trust me, we were making huge strides already, there was just one thing I had to go back and collect. It was time to visit what was once a grand paradise. Located in the ruins of the old industrial paradise was a relic that I had to acquire if I was going to defeat Robert. This relic was essential if we were going to take back the moon base as well as rebuild our old world. I had plans that could only be realized on the old side of our industrial progress. It was time to rebuild at last. Leave a like and leave a comment if you want 800 days, because we can't leave this place in shambles. There's just so much to do and so much to retake. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and if you want some of the builds you saw today, they will be available for download on Patreon. Thank you to all the patrons for supporting this video. This has been Doublesal. I will see you in the next one. 100 days. Thank you for watching.